Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Wilf Keller. I'm currently serving as President and CEO of Ag West Bio. We really function as Saskatchewan's bioscience association. And we're funded through the Provincial Ministry of Agriculture and also Agriculture Canada through their Growing Forward 2 program, and we really want to acknowledge and recognize that support. We've been around for 24 years, first formed in 1989. And as a bioscience association, we're very interested in supporting the growth of new companies, particularly small new companies, new ventures in the biosciences. We are certainly engaged in building the cluster, working with the community, the various public organizations, trying to support the establishment of partnerships. We're involved with missions coming in from other countries. We assist in outgoing missions to other countries. We are actively involved in conferences and seminar organizations. I'm sure many of you have seen some of the seminars that we put on a wide range of subjects in the area of agriculture. The lecture tonight is part of National Biotechnology Week. And National Biotechnology Week was created through Biotech Canada, a national organization. This was created about 10 years ago. And it's really to celebrate and raise awareness around new technologies, bioscience, and biotechnology. This particular week, National Biotech Week, is supported in every province, and our organization, Ag West Bio, coordinates events here in Saskatchewan. Biotech Week has been proclaimed officially in Saskatchewan by the Government of Saskatchewan through the Ministry of Agriculture, the City of Regina, and the City of Saskatoon. I'd like to thank the various organizations that have supported this event. They include Innovation Saskatchewan, Genome Prairie, the National Research Council, the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, located both in Saskatoon and Regina, and the Saskatoon Regional Economic Development Authority. I'd also like to thank the volunteer committee drawn from a range of organizations, quite a number of people who helped make the many events that are happening this week. And this is not the only event. There are other events, and you can check our website for those. I would like to thank also the experts who agreed to sit on the panel tonight, and you'll be hearing from them, and they will be helping with the questions. Now, the format for tonight's event is as follows. Mark Lynas, our guest lecturer, will present his presentation on sustainable agriculture, GMO, organic, and how to feed the world. That'll last approximately 50 minutes. This will then be followed by the panel. Mark and the panel will be available for questions. The panel consists of 4 local experts and a moderator, and that particular part of the program will probably last 40 to 45 minutes. So about an hour and a half for the whole event. We are really pleased and delighted that Mark Lynas was able to come to Saskatoon from Oxford. It actually takes a fair effort to get to Saskatoon from Oxford, England. He has become a tireless spokesperson for new technologies, bioscience and biotechnology. He's in a very unique position to comment. He's an environmental author and campaigner. He is very knowledgeable in a range of environmental issues. He was, until recently, advisor to the President of the Maldives, as well as being a visiting research associate at Oxford's University School of Geography and Environment. He has researched and written extensively about climate change. In July, he published an e-book, Nuclear 2.0, Why a Green Future Needs Nuclear Power. Mark has done more than that. He has a recent book in print form, known under the title, The God Species, tracing how humanity must respect the Earth's biosphere to keep the planet habitable. His previous 2 books, 6 Degrees and High Tide, have focused on the issue of global warming. We have 4 books for which we will be making a draw at the end of the evening. So if you filled out that little tab when you came in, you have a chance to win one of these books. In the 1990s, Mark was heavily involved as an environmental activist and journalist. He wrote critical articles that were often part of the anti-GM movement. In recent months, Mark has re-examined that position, and he delivered a talk, for example, at the Oxford Farming Conference several months ago, in which he apologized for past activities to a room full of scientists. Obviously, this would cause somewhat of a stir, but he's actually been invited now to make a number of presentations. He is a very dedicated environmental researcher. He is very knowledgeable. I had a chance to speak to him a little bit. He's here to tell a story of why he changed his mind and why research in genetics and bioscience can play an important role in society and around the planet. So without any further comments, I would like to welcome Mark Lynas. Please welcome Mark Lynas to the podium.
Well, this is more people than I ever used to get to my climate change lectures. So thanks all for being here. I was just saying earlier that everyone should be famous for doing one stupid thing in their lives, and mine was to give this speech in Oxford earlier this year, making an apology for being an anti-GMO activist. Not so much to a room full of scientists, actually, but really to a room full of farmers, some of whose crops I had personally attacked and helped destroy. And to tell this story, I suppose I should begin at the beginning. And here we all are back in, I think, 1996, 97. I'm actually in that picture. You win one of the signed copies of the books if you can find out which person I am. And this is a field, actually, of what we called oilseed rape. I think it's known as canola here, which was part of the government-sponsored field trials to investigate the environmental impacts of GM crops back in the mid-1990s. And we were convinced that these crops were a threat to the environment, that they promoted corporate monopolization of the world's food supply, that there was something unnatural about moving genes between unrelated species, and that scientists had extended technological power too far. Now, I believe now that we were wrong on all of those issues, but it was a long process for me to change my mind about this. Changing your mind about anything is not easy. It's painful, it's difficult, it's lengthy, and it's actually highly embarrassing. Now, if I think back to what we used to feel about GMOs and look at some of the imagery that was employed then and is still employed now, aimed at scaring people, because of course no one ever did make corn with fangs. I'm told the fangs only come out at night, you can't see them in the day. Why was this? And this is a genuinely worldwide movement which I was involved in the early incipient stages of. There was something there which triggered the reaction from the environmental movements in a way which hadn't been seen really for decades. And this has made echoes around the world and has really, to a large extent, forestalled the biotechnology revolution and the promise that it held. So what happened? Well, I moved from being an activist at that point to wanting to work more specifically on climate change. And I started a project in about 2002, which was when I took these photos, or took one of these photos, to document the impacts of climate change around the world. The photo on the right, I don't know if you've seen these before, they were actually in Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, although he wrongly ascribed the location here to being Argentina. It's actually in Peru. And my father took the picture on the left in 1980 when he was working in this region as a geologist. I took the picture on the right when we went back in 2002, 22 years later. And in just one generation of my own family, this glacier had disappeared. And so here was for me a very powerful and moving illustration of the impacts that climate change is having on mountain regions around the world in terms of glacial retreat, which has knock-on effects for the water supplies of people in vulnerable countries like Peru. But of course, this is just an anecdote, and an anecdote doesn't tell you anything. Only data can tell you the true story and give you a true picture, and data is not the plural of anecdote. And I'm I have an MA in history and politics from the University of Edinburgh. I'm not a scientist. I stopped doing science at the age of 16 as soon as I could. So I had to relearn or learn from scratch what science meant. And it was a truly extraordinary, eye-opening process. In the same year, I went to Tuvalu, which is a small Pacific island nation threatened by sea level rise, and took these pictures of how the rising waters are already coming into people's houses in the high tides, which are becoming increasingly frequent. And again, how do we know that this is a real phenomenon? Well, we could tell now from the satellite data that sea levels are rising by 3 or so millimeters per year. That's how we know global warming is not stopped, by the way. And with that data set, of course, and there's tidal gauges in different regions of the world as well, including here in Tuvalu, that's how I could tell that what I was seeing actually illustrated a real trend scientifically. So I moved into the Radcliffe Science Library of Oxford University and spent a good 2 years looking into climate science, all aspects of climate science. So at the end of that, I could boast that I knew more about glaciers than oceanographers and more about oceans than glaciologists. And to have a kind of interdisciplinary approach to this actually was one of the benefits of not being a properly trained scientist and not having a PhD in a single, very highly specialized discipline. And I rode out to do battle against the climate change skeptics, the deniers, as I did and still do call them, people who refuse to accept the reality of global warming in our world. And then I went on to publish another book in 2007 called 6 Degrees. And this was even more sciencey. It even won the Science Books Prize from the Royal Society, which is the UK's premier scientific institution. And so I felt like I was, in turn, getting recognition from the scientific community, having spent so long buried in the peer-reviewed literature and becoming acquainted with looking at the statistical methodologies which the scientists are employing, and trying to really develop my role as a translator, as a communicator between scientists who are uniformly pretty bad at talking to the general public, and journalists who are uniformly pretty bad at covering science. So I wanted to do something a bit different and a bit more in between, where I could be as much of an expert as it's possible to be without having that specialist training, but at the same time able to speak and communicate to the general public about this very important issue. And so I would lecture the skeptics about the importance of peer review and how we needed to understand and respect the scientific consensus on the climate change issue in particular. But at the same time, I was still writing anti-biotech articles, and this is the last and extremely quite embarrassing one, which was published in The Guardian, and as I said there, it's still online, including the comments underneath, which were some of the comments which really made me start to reassess my position on this. People said, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He hasn't looked at the science. He can't have possibly have read the science on this issue. And that was true. I hadn't read the science on that issue. Even though I'd read the science on climate change, and I prided myself on being scientifically well informed about this issue. So I didn't immediately go and make a big speech about this. I decided to go and to do some reading and to try and become a bit more expert about this. And at the same time, as you heard earlier, I had this role as advisor to President Nasheed in the Maldives on climate change. And one of my roles as his advisor was to give him the latest scientific information. I never asked for this job, by the way. It's rather a strange story, but they appointed me without asking me. And I was in the Maldives for a conference, and they invited me to go and meet the president. And he gave me this big piece of paper that said, "You're now the president's advisor." And I said, "Oh, okay." So, but I wanted to try and do the job properly. And so I also spent a long time as a negotiator for the Maldives, representing the country in the United Nations negotiations. So that was a very challenging process, but again, it has to be a science-based and evidence-based process. That's central to how these negotiations continue. And at the same time, I wanted to start writing again, and I started work on this book called The God Species, which was looking at the concept of ecological limits. Are there real ecological limits in the Earth's biosphere and the ecosystems, which constrain humanity's ability to use the Earth's resources? Climate change being a good example, but there being other ones as well. And it began with this concept of the Anthropocene, this idea that we've moved into a new geological era, one which is dominated by the human species. The Holocene is over, the Anthropocene has begun, because we've dramatically begun to alter the biogeophysical cycles of the Earth. We've altered the chemistry of the atmosphere, even the color of the skies, the pH of the oceans, the species, biodiversity that shares this planet with us has all begun to change very dramatically. Biodiversity I put as the first chapter because I was beginning to think that this really is the number one challenge, because it has such an irreversibility to it that once you've extinguished a species, once a wild species has gone extinct, there's no bringing them back, there's no restoring their place in the lost place in the ecosystem. So when we're in a situation where on the latest IUCN Red List, it's a quarter of mammals, a third of amphibians, a sixth of birds, a quarter of corals, a quarter of freshwater fish are classified as threatened or endangered. This is the number one challenge really that humanity faces. And looking at these issues began to make me more and more interested in agriculture, because the loss of habitat is the number one cause of biodiversity decline, and the number one cause of loss of habitat is conversion of land for cultivation to feed our own species, of course. Now, the planetary boundaries included many areas. I won't go through all of them, but I was also looking at the use of fresh water. Humanity's now impounded something like 10,000 cubic kilometers of fresh water behind dams on land, enough actually to measurably reduce the rate of sea level rise because we've taken so much water onto land. And we've, in the process, fragmented riverine ecosystems around the world. There is not very many big rivers left which flow untrammeled all the way from their source down to the sea. And some of the biggest rivers in the world no longer reach the sea for much of the year. That's happened to the Yellow River in China, and of course also to the Colorado, pictured here at the Hoover Dam in the United States. So how could we look at agriculture in a different way, which actually means that we could use less water? Because agriculture is, again, by far the largest use of water that humanity has around the world. And another of the planetary boundaries that the scientific team that I was working with were proposing was the idea of nitrogen. So we're all familiar with how far humans have altered the Earth's carbon cycle. We've increased the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by over 30% since pre-industrial times. We've doubled the rate of nitrogen, terrestrial nitrogen fixation. This was one of humanity's great achievements, of course, was the ability to feed ourselves from producing artificial fertilizers. The invention of the Haber-Bosch process by Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch back in the 1910s, before the First World War, was probably one of humanity's defining achievements. And it's enabled the population now to increase to the levels that it has. Before that, when we were constrained by simply organic farming, the nutrient scarcity of nitrogen in particular was one of the major constraints on global agriculture, and that was solved by the production of artificial ammonia. But of course, that has knock-on effects in the ecosystem, which are no longer nitrogen limited to the extent that they were, particularly in freshwater ecosystems, and where those rivers empty into the sea. We have increasing dead zones, such as this famous one, which is now a regular summertime phenomenon in the Gulf of Mexico. 20,000 square kilometers of the Gulf of Mexico are now classified as a dead zone in an average summer, as a result, of course, of the runoff of nitrogen from the US Corn Belt. So I mentioned earlier about biodiversity and about land use. Well, land use change became one of the planetary boundaries which was being looked at as well. And for me, this meant that I needed to go back and look at productivity, because it's the efficiency with which we're using these resources, the scarce resources, land in particular, which then becomes the number one environmental criterion that you're using. And so I wrote a chapter which actually was quite critical of the organic approach to farming, although, and I'll say in a minute, organic has some beneficial aspects to it as well. But in terms of land use, because productivity is 40 to 50% lower on average, you then have to use nearly twice as much land to produce the same amount of food. And so the knock-on effect of that, of course, is that you need to cultivate more land to produce the same food that you wanted before. And so, to a certain extent, if we were to try to produce all the world's food supply organically, they'd have very little space left for rainforests, for wetlands, and for other ecosystems which we value for the natural services that they provide. Now, one of the good things about organic, of course, is the focus on the reduction of toxic chemicals, and of course also on nitrogen as well, but then that has the effect on productivity that I mentioned earlier. But this is something which is a real challenge, I think, to agriculture, is how to be increasingly sustainable in terms of how we use chemistry. And I began a chapter on this which was anti-GMO, but because I was reading through the peer-reviewed literature, I realized actually that there was very little supporting evidence for my preconceptions on this, and I ended up writing pretty much a pro-GMO chapter, looking in particular at how we are already reducing some of the uses of toxic insecticides in particular through the deployment of BT crops and many others. And I don't know if this is working. And at the same time, I wanted to continue the story about climate change and to look at how we're in a situation where, given that world temperatures are not standing still, nor can our approach to how we produce food. As the planet heats up, thermal zones are beginning to change, farming systems are going to have to change with it, the thermal tolerance of crops, major crops, is going to become increasingly difficult. And as a result of this, and this picture, of course, is only going to intensify, we need to think rather differently about how climate change is going to pressure us into producing food very differently, and how we can promote biodiversity and other major ecological concerns at the same time as the global average temperature is continuing to increase, and probably at an accelerating rate. Now, I mentioned before about the scientific consensus on climate change. In just about a week's time, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, will be producing its fifth assessment report. This report, which has already received a lot of negative coverage from the skeptic community in the press and elsewhere — I think there was a piece in the Financial Post here in Canada — I think it's really important to understand that the consensus is stronger than ever on climate change. This was a statement produced by the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, which is the typical kind of statement you'll see for any of the major scientific groups. It's pretty unequivocal, and in fact the IPCC report, the new report which is coming out next week, I think will increase the levels of confidence which are now being spoken about. So I think it's going to be 95% certain that human activities have caused the majority of the warming since 1950s. So there really isn't any significant doubt within the scientific community about the reality of climate change and the extent to which humans have contributed to this situation. And the thing which was really the tipping point for me was finding out that there was a similar consensus statement on biotechnology made by the same institution, the AAAS. And if you look at the flick between them, look at the language, the scientific evidence is clear, the science is quite clear on both these issues. And as the AAAS says on biotech, crop improvement by modern molecular techniques of biotechnology is safe. So we don't need to have this debate about the safety of the GMO, OMG, and all of this kind of stuff. This is not a debate which is happening within the scientific community, it's a debate which is happening outside it, in the activist scene and other people who are trying to create fear about this issue. And again, consuming foods containing ingredients derived from GM crops is no riskier than the foods produced by crop plants modified by conventional techniques. And this isn't just one institution, of course, this is a view which is shared widely by every scientific institution which writes about this issue. I think in total now there's well over 600 peer-reviewed articles, papers published in the literature about GMOs, and there's never been a single substantiated case of harm. So this is a non-issue, this is a non-debate. It's a bit like debating whether climate change is real. It's not happening within the scientific community. So here are equivalent statements from the American Medical Association, from the World Health Organization of the UN, and numerous other institutions, including the European Commission, by the way. So the idea that European officials are anti-GMO simply isn't substantiated. So on the basis of this, I did my stupid thing and made this speech in Oxford. And what happened was that the chairman of this conference, which is an annual conference, it's called the Oxford Farming Conference, who's a friend of mine who lives not far away and actually runs a mostly organic farm, invited me because he'd read my God Species book to come and make some kind of needlessly provocative statements, which I duly did. And I kind of, I'm not sure why, because I knew this was going to have an impact, and I didn't want the focus of this debate to come to me, but I just thought I had a duty to say what I thought, because I changed my mind so strongly about this, and I was becoming so resentful of the way that the environmental movement has continued to dominate with a kind of denialist narrative about GMOs, that I thought I really needed to come clean and say what I thought. And it kind of went viral on the internet and even crashed my website because it was downloaded by hundreds of thousands of people within a matter of a day or two. And immediately there was this backlash that came from the antis. I will give you a moment or two to read this because it's quite entertaining. But this is the kind of stuff that now goes, that you can see on social media, on Facebook and so on. It says at the end, please share this so people will learn what a vile, loathsome creature I actually am. Thanks. I love the way it says thanks, you know. Also, note that that isn't actually me. They had to find another corporate shill to pose for this picture. And since then, I've fallen into a really fascinating role with the Gates Foundation, where I've been traveling around Africa. East Africa, I've been to now 3 countries, to Uganda, to Kenya, and to Tanzania, both doing advocacy work with the scientific communities over there who are working on this issue, promoting more sustainable crops and food security, and also meeting farmers in the field. These so-called biotech banana farmers, they're not actually GMO, these are tissue culture bananas. I don't know if you all know, but bananas are clonally propagated, so they only come from saplings. But if they get clean tissue culture saplings, then they don't have any of the infections which are now becoming increasingly a problem in this part of the world. And one of the things which left me most angry and upset was meeting these people in Tanzania whose cassava crop has begun to fail as a result of this new virus called brown streak virus. And this is really a terrible thing which has affected many of these countries now. These viral diseases actually destroy the crops which people most depend on. These are their most important food security crops. And you can see this farmer here is standing in front of the plant, and what was really weird was he didn't know what was causing this problem. He thought that the sunshine was too strong or something like that. And the kids in the region were visibly malnourished. These are people who depend on their harvest for what they eat. You know, they don't have the money to go to the shops and buy food, obviously. And if these cassava plants, which you can see in the foreground and the background with these kids, are failing, then that's their last option. After that, they go hungry. And at the same time, I knew, because I just visited the government research station in Uganda, that a GMO virus-resistant cassava has already been developed. It's been in field trials for several years. It's the same varieties of cassava that these farmers are accustomed to growing, and it works. I mean, you could see those cassava plants, and this is a virus-affected one and a resistant one that the researcher here is holding. These plants were the most healthy cassava plants I saw in my entire time in Africa. And can they get them? No, because they're securely under lock and key, because of biosafety regulations and because activists in Africa have spread rumors amongst the farming community that these GMOs are going to cause terrible impacts. So I had when I was doing a talk in Tanzania in a fairly remote place, I had farmers standing up saying that they knew that these GMOs were going to turn their kids homosexual. That this was I would have walked out had I not said it in Swahili, just through the offensiveness of that kind of statement. And these activists were organic. This was one of the Tanzania's organic movements who'd been going around saying these kinds of things. And so they had this conspiracy theory that the GMOs were intended to stop Africans being able to reproduce. This is why it was going to turn them homosexual. It was going to sterilize their land. It was going to poison the soil, poison their kids. And it reminded me very much of the anti-vaccine conspiracy theories which have also been circulating in Africa, in Nigeria, and this was again something which affected the Gates Foundation in its work. There were conspiracy theories spread by the Nigerian Muslim mullahs that the polio vaccines were going to turn their children sterile. And of course, in both these cases, the results have been extremely negative. When I was in Uganda, there were parliamentarians telling me how activists, in one case, had gone to the community and told Muslims that there were pig genes being put into bananas, and this was obviously offensive to their religion, and causing almost a riot in that case. There's people going around with photoshopped pictures of ears of corn with babies' heads coming out. And of course, these are illiterate farmers. They don't know about Photoshop. They think this is real. And at the same time, the government is under pressure not to allow any GMOs at all. And so these crops stay behind these fences at the same time as people on the outside are going hungry, because the virus, the diseases which these crops are meant to address, continue to run rampant through their food supplies. And perhaps an even more recent dramatic story has come about with the golden rice situation. I don't know how much you know about this, but vitamin A, this is also a GM rice variety which has been developed to try to address vitamin A deficiency, which is a major problem around the world. I think something like 1.5 to 2 million children die per year as a result of vitamin A deficiency. Many more of them turn blind as a result of this. And the idea is to get provitamin A, so beta-carotene, into the staple food which is currently lacking it, which is, of course, rice. Rice expresses pretty much no beta-carotene at all in its endosperm in the seed. And so the gene to do this has been introduced from maize, so it's from another food crop. And it's now in field trials in the Philippines. It's planned to be introduced in Bangladesh and in Indonesia pretty soon. This is in the screen house where I'm looking in the University of Los Baños in the Philippines. And what's happening here is that the genes expressing beta-carotene are being put into the farmer-preferred variety. So it's not like there would be a single cultivar, a single variety of rice which everyone would have to plant. This would go into multiple varieties which are adapted to the local soils and to the local conditions. And the rice that comes out, of course, is yellow. That's why it's called golden rice, because it has beta-carotene in, just like carrots. And so this, potentially on the left, there's Dr. Gerard Barry, who's the project leader at the International Rice Research Institute. This rice could be a lifesaver. But about 3 weeks ago, just before I arrived, one of the local anti-GMO activist groups had destroyed the whole field trial in one of the locations where this rice is currently being grown. And they were putting out press statements that they were farmers, that local farmers had this uprising and had trashed these rice crops. And the people who saw this knew this wasn't true, because not only did they know the local farming community, but also there's a taboo on destroying a green rice plant. So every child in a farming community will learn you don't ever tread on rice. It's almost like it's a sacred thing. And it's even has bad effects, that when rice is diseased and it needs to be pulled up, they won't touch it, and then it would affect more of the crop. So we know that these were not real farmers. There were activist groups who have a very extreme sort of anti-technology, anti-corporate, anti-globalization type agenda. And unfortunately, the field trial was completely destroyed in that case, which means potentially that these trials have to be repeated, which that would then hold back the project, the launch of the project for another year, or if not longer. And remember, this is a situation where something like 6,000 children are dying per day as a result of vitamin A deficiency. There's been a real outpouring of support, I think, and anger from the scientific community about this issue. There was a very strongly worded editorial statement, signed editorial statement in Science at the beginning of just this week, which again I'll put up there for you on the slide. And you don't hear this kind of language from scientists normally. If there ever was a clear-cut cause for outrage, it's the concerted campaign by Greenpeace and other NGOs against golden rice. And then they tell you the statistics. Disease, poverty, and poor diet responsible for 1.9 to nearly 3 million preventable deaths annually. And this is signed by by 11 of the top scientists in the world, including Martin Rees there, who's a former president of the Royal Society, Nina Fedorov, who used to be a science advisor to Hillary Clinton, one of the best molecular biologists in the world, and many others as well. Now, for me, this has really crystallized how we need to somehow find a game-changing argument here. And I would say this isn't about being pro-GMO, it's about being pro-science and having an evidence-based approach to how you make decisions about these things. I completely agree that it would be entirely possible to make a bad GMO, something which had deleterious effects, but we have to assess these things on a case-by-case basis. And I think that one of the ways to turn around this argument is to make it clearer and clearer to people that biotechnology can be used to advance environmental sustainability. The irony is, in some ways, that biotechnology can do what organic farming has for so long aimed to do, which is to reduce and hopefully eliminate the worst agrochemicals. If you take just this case, I grow a few potatoes in my allotment garden, and every single year when it's a wet year, we get an outbreak of late blight, Phytophthora infestans, nasty stuff, fungal disease. It's controlled in commercial scale farming, as those of you who know about potato farming will know, by repeated sprays of fungicide. So fungicides sprayed every week on your average conventional potato crop in order to prevent blight infestation. And there's a GMO potato already been designed. It's in field trials in the UK and other European countries, and I think also has been designed. There's been contributions here in Canada for that. But again, there's no prospect of this being able to be used by farmers because of the superstition which now attaches to anything which has the GMO label. The widespread use of BT technology has enabled the reduction of insecticide applications by something like 500 million kilograms since the mid-1990s, according to assessments that I've seen, and have promoted biodiversity in the field. So because this is very specifically targeted at only those pests which are boring into the crop, then non-target insects, which would otherwise be affected by sprays, are left undisturbed, and this promotes biodiversity not just in insects but in bird populations and elsewhere. So absolutely reducing the use of toxins in the field is the vital thing that we need to see happen. I worked also with some of the scientists at Rothamsted in trying to communicate the benefits of their GM aphid-resistant wheat. And this is an interesting case. The scientists didn't particularly want to come out and have to have a public voice about this, but they were forced to when the activists set a date for when they were going to destroy this field trial as well. And this was now 2 summers ago. This wheat, by the way, expresses a pheromone called E-beta-farnesene, which is naturally produced by aphids as their alarm signal. So if you disturb aphids on the plant, they will spray this stuff out and it'll tell all the other aphids to drop off and to basically run off. And it's there, you can see it's found in mint, and it's found in a variety of other plant species as well. So they put this into the wheat because wheat doesn't have it, just experimentally to see whether this helps repel aphids. And so these have been in field trials as well. And of course, the point here is to reduce aphid infestation without having to spray again. So you can make a clear environmental case for why this was a technology which was worth looking at. And Rothamsted are also looking at developing omega-3 oil seeds. So the idea is to be able to have sustainable land-based feedstocks for salmon farming and for aquaculture in general. At the moment, of course, you have to go and fish wild fish out of the oceans, turn them into fish food, and then feed them to the farm fish. If we can get this from canola, basically, then we can look to having much more sustainable approaches to fisheries where we don't have to destroy marine biodiversity on a large scale. I mentioned about water. Well, in Africa, there's a huge problem of increasing droughts with climate change, and also of people not having access to irrigation. They don't have the capital to invest in producing boreholes or other facilities you need for irrigation. So the technology for drought tolerance is now being used, in fact, been developed by Monsanto, those evil geniuses down in St. Louis, and they donated the technology to this project, which is also co-run by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, aiming to have water-efficient maize available at cost, or free, in fact, to African farmers as soon as 2017. The statistics are that there's 300 million people in Africa who depend on maize for their staple food, so this is a very important crop for them to be developing. I also have been quite struck by how the debate has begun to change in the scientific community about how there's no real basis for the term GMO anymore, because there's so many different techniques which are used that there's no way you could draw a straightforward line between what's GM and what isn't GM. For example, there's been a lot of work now which shows that mutagenesis actually creates far more changes to the genome than the very targeted use of recombinant DNA. And some of our experts who are going to come and talk to us in the panel later, from the panel, can explain to us a bit more about this. And I think this is another way to begin to change the debate, that if you want your foodstuffs labeled, then fine, label it, but say what the process is. Say, right, this has been treated, this crop has been developed using gamma radiation mutagenesis. Let's put that on the label. Or cisgenesis, it's a gene from the same species, but it's been moved there so you don't have to have all of the backcrossing, all of the complicated, long-winded stuff which you need to get the traits that you want. And also let's have a debate about the dangers in some other organics or other systems like organic, which has been associated with microbial outbreaks, which have caused serious damage to people's health in certain cases. In Germany, there was the famous case of the E. coli outbreak in bean sprouts, which had the same death and injury toll as the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. 50 people died, 3,000 people were seriously injured by this. Probably, and I'm not saying this is certain, but probably because of manure residues in the seeds, which were then used to germinate for bean sprouts. Now, I'm not saying that organic food is dangerous. It's actually extremely safe, but so is all of the rest of the food. So we just need to have a more sensible debate about this. And in fact, microbial infestation is the #1 threat to food safety. Organic, conventional, it doesn't matter. When you've got Listeria, E. coli, hepatitis, these are the things that actually do affect people's health. And it's important also to look at how increased productivity has spared land from the curse of the plough in the past. This yellow area here is the land that would have had to have been cultivated to get today's yield using the technologies of 1960. And this is just looking at India in particular, but I think the statistics globally are something like 2 billion hectares would have had to be cultivated if we were still using the technologies of 40 years ago to get today's overall food supply. And why is this a problem? Well, because we know overall that we're going to have to continue to increase the amount of food that we produce in tandem with the rising human population. There's no doubt really that the population is going to increase to about 9.5 billion by 2050. And the reason for that, by the way, isn't that people in Africa are having too many babies. The reason for this is that there's been a big reduction in infant mortality, which of course is a good thing, and a big increase in life expectancy. So the average global rate of fertility is now down to about 2.4. So that's 2.4 children per woman, which isn't going to lead to very rapid population growth in the future. But what's happening is that people, particularly young children, are no longer dying. This does mean that we're going to have 1 billion more mouths to feed in the next 12 years. And just to go back to that graph, you see how these lines between the rate of increase of productivity of just cereals has begun to fall back from the rate of population growth. So how are we going to meet this challenge increasing the world's food production by 100% by 2050, and doing so in a way which is increasingly sustainable, and which doesn't mean that we have to increase the amount of food, the amount of cropland that we're bringing into cultivation? Well, the answer is that we need a new green revolution. I don't think we can do that without widespread use of agricultural biotechnology, and neither did Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for having saved 1 billion lives through the new varieties of wheat which he cultivated and developed himself in Mexico, and then took to India and to Pakistan and to other parts of the world, who then on the basis of that experienced a productivity revolution which took them from a situation of constant chronic famine to one where they became food surplus, food exporting countries within as little as 1 decade. Now, even back then, and I read a biography of Norman Borlaug recently, they had people saying that his new wheat varieties were going to turn their land sterile, they were going to poison their children. And what made this happen and what made this work was leadership. There was leadership from the Indian government, from the Pakistani government, to face down the antis, to face down the naysayers and say, we do and we should take a science-based approach to this. We should take agricultural innovation, the best that science can produce with new technologies, and take it to the farmer. And in fact, those were Norman Borlaug's last words before he died. Someone had come to him on his deathbed, he was dying of leukemia, I think, and said to him that they'd developed this new crop, and his last words were, take it to the farmer. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Now we're going to move on to the question and answer portion of this event, and I would like the panelists to come up, and it says take your seat on the stage. I'm sure some seats will become available momentarily. But while we're getting ready, I'd like to introduce the moderator, and that is Chris Barker. Chris Barker is the Chief Scientific Officer at Genome Prairie, and his role and responsibilities for the organization's strategic research and partnership agenda. Chris is well known in our community. He has extensive technical and scientific experience. He's a master at project management. He's been active in several different organizations. He joined Genome Prairie in 2006 as a project manager, did a terrific job, and since then has managed several different programs and projects. He works in close collaboration with stakeholders from across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and in fact across Canada. I'm going to give the podium to Chris to take over from here, so please welcome Chris Barker.
All right. Okay, fantastic crowd out for this. It's just wonderful to see. Thank you, Mark, for a wonderful presentation and talking about the need for a science-based approach and communicating that. Before we get started with the panel, there's one thing that I'd like to say. One of my favorite quotes, never before have so many people understood so little about so much. And that was a quote from 1979 by James Burke, a scientific historian. And it was right at the birth of modern biotechnology, and it's just as relevant today that there's so much happening in the world of science and development that the average person simply doesn't have the educational resources to understand, and the need for groups like this to communicate that to as many people as possible is just so very important. So before we get started with the question and answer session, a couple of ground rules. I believe there's some volunteers out in the audience that if you don't want to come up to the microphone, if you want to have your question asked, I will do that. You can write it down on a card. There should be some volunteers out there that could give you a card to write it down. They're in the back. Okay, and let's keep it to questions. When you come up, please use the microphone succinctly, ask a question, and allow the panelists to respond. This is not an opportunity for everyone to get up and have some podium time. Okay, so keep your questions short and to the point. And the last thing is respect for everyone's opinion. There are very strong feelings on both sides of the GMO question. Let's try to remember that we all love our children, and no matter what side of the debate we're on, we want a better world for the future. So with that, I will introduce the panelists. We'll start on the far side with Cami Ryan. She's a researcher with the College of Agriculture and Bioresources at the University of Saskatchewan. Then we have Janice Tranberg, who is Vice President Western Canada for CropLife Canada. And then Stuart Smythe, research scientist with the Department of Bioresource Policy, Business and Economics at the University of Saskatchewan. And then Wally Ham, who is the president of ProCert Organic Systems, and of course, Mark. With that, I'll give each of the panelists a couple of minutes to provide a bit of their background, and then we'll get started with questions.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Cami, and I work with the University of Saskatchewan, as Chris said, and my area of research revolves around essentially innovation in agriculture, but a lot of my recent interest over the last 2 or 3 years is how science is communicated, people's perceptions of science, in particular around agricultural biotechnology. I'm very interested in farming and agriculture and food production. I consider myself a consumer advocate because I really am one person that likes to make sure that there is the right information out there. We deal with a lot of information, lots of misinformation, and sometimes it's really hard to separate the wheat from the chaff.
Thank you. So my name is Janice Tranberg, and I work with CropLife Canada. And to give you a bit of background on who I am and how I came here, I started out as a research scientist, and while I love the science, I realized that I probably wasn't a very good scientist. But what I am good at is taking a look at the whole picture and what biotechnology can do, for the world. So I've had background in research, background in communications and regulatory affairs and policy. And my area of expertise probably here would be representing what the industry is doing and regulatory affairs. And before I pass the mic, I just want to say I really, really respect everybody coming out today and their opinions. Many people are extremely passionate about this topic, and I'd like to think that I'm equally as passionate.
Thank you. And so as Chris mentioned, my name's Stuart Smythe. I grew up on a mixed farm in the southeast part of the province and had thoroughly intended to never be here tonight because I was supposed to be farming. But in the late 80s, when I was looking at getting into farming, interest rates were 18 and 20%, and it just didn't make a lot of fiscal sense. So I spun the wheel a little bit and tried a variety of things and sort of stumbled into academics by accident and found out that this was an awfully interesting way to be involved in agriculture and to really limit my fiscal risk. So I've been involved in looking at how agricultural innovations are regulated and the international trade. So a lot of my research is based on our experience in Western Canada with GM canola. I've looked at how it was developed, how it was initially approved for production, how it's traded, what the benefits to farmers are, what the benefits to consumers and the environment is, and then sort of expanded that into looking at how other GM crops have been produced in other countries and what the impacts are for food security. So it's for someone who grew up on a farm, it's really a dream come true to be able to be involved in agriculture and really not lose my shirt at my job.
I'm Wallace Ham. I'm a soil scientist, an agrologist, and currently I'm also a certifier of organic food, a producer of organic food, and a consumer of organic food. I was involved in conventional agriculture very deeply for about 30 years as a producer, as a member of the U of S faculty in soil science and director of the soil testing laboratory. About 1995 or so, my farm was viable, my job was viable, but the value of canola, which I grew as part of my rotation, dropped from $9 a bushel to $5 a bushel because the Europeans rejected Canada's genetically modified canola. At the same time, I also got involved with certifying organic farms on a small scale. And much like our apostate friend over here, I became somewhat an apostate in terms of high technology. I began to enjoy farming organically. I didn't have to use pesticide. My input bills were way down. I had a very biodiverse population in my fields. And I also enjoyed working with other farmers who were using traditional technology to make a living. And I'm doing this today. I am more economically viable now than I was in 1995. I farm more acres. I have more wildlife on my farm. I have a wonderful habitat. And I'm enjoying life. I don't have to spray my crops every year as I did for 30 years. I can actually breathe, and I can live in June when I used to get sick from herbicide damage to my lungs and to my health. So I'm a much happier person now. I'm quite comfortable being in the organic agricultural world. And I must say, before I turn the mic over, I suppose, is that the organic production of food, and if you want to call it organic, you can call it natural, you can call it traditional, but it has 14,000 years of history, okay? Modern technology, which started probably the 1940s, 1950s, involving pesticides, now more recently genetically modified organisms, has something like 50 or 60 years of history. So if history is going to be our instructor, our teacher in life, perhaps that's something to keep in mind tonight. We have 14,000 years in which people fed themselves without any major technology. And now we're saying we're going to change all that and feed the future people depending entirely on technology. And that's a bit of a stretch for me personally at my age and with my experience in life. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Okay. The mic is open. We have a traveling mic here if anybody would like to raise their hand and ask any questions.
Hi there. My question is, one of the limits to, I guess, having a human population on Earth that I didn't hear mentioned was topsoil loss, and particularly for monocrops grown, certainly in Saskatchewan, wheat, etc. And maybe if you could talk about maybe your thoughts on permaculture. I'm not sure how else to phrase that question.
Yeah, I think both GM crop production and organic production and even conventional production has changed with technology over the last 30 years. I'm sure Wally remembers lots of summer fallow dirt being blown in the air in the 80s when it was really dry in this province. And one of the things that's really changed is the knowledge about the damage that cultivation was doing to a lot of our agriculture land in terms of erosion, moisture conservation loss. So we've moved to continuous cropping systems. We've got new seeding technology that allows farmers to continuous crop and to seed into undisturbed soil beds. It's not so much the type of crop that's being grown, but it's sort of an education of agricultural land management or sustainable agriculture that's allowed us to move in this direction. And I think all of the forms of agriculture have benefited from this knowledge.
Wally, is there anything you want to add to that?
Not a great deal, except that we must go back in time again in history. You'll find that most of the plants that we've propagated in the last 14,000 years and domesticated were in fact perennials. Perennial crop production is still the best way to conserve soil. In my rotation in our farm, and something that we advocate to our clients now, is to get a good portion of the land into perennials, and particularly perennial alfalfa, which fixes nitrogen in the order of 90 to 150 pounds of N per acre without using natural gas or any other technology. And it basically sustains topsoil, it sustains productivity, Alfalfa happens to be a deep-rooted plant, so it also brings phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, micronutrients to the surface, to the plow layer, to the AP horizon, if you wish, which then allows production in future years. So you basically, in a sustainable organic agriculture rotation, you have a good deal, you must have a good deal portion of your land in a perennial situation. In terms of research, I'd like to see a little discussion about perennial plants again. There's institutions now in North America that are talking about reinstating perennial plants as a source of food. I'm extremely intrigued about that because that's where we started thousands of years ago.
Go ahead, Jim.
You know, I'm reminded of a professor at the University of Saskatchewan who said that it was his retirement, and Gordon Rowland. And at his retirement, he talked about how when he was a young scientist and he came to Saskatchewan, and he was from Winnipeg, and he was driving through the countryside, and he would see all these fields that were black, summer fallow. And he commented how now when he drives through the countryside, he doesn't see that anymore. And so, and from his perspective, and from my perspective, a lot of that's due to minimum till and no-till. So by using biotechnology in the seeds, it means that we can control our weeds without having to till. So this is the process called minimum or no-till. And you can take a seeder now and you can direct seed into the stubble. And so by being able to direct seed and keep your stubble on the fields, the soil doesn't blow around, so you don't lose soil. It retains more moisture. It increases the buildup of organic matter. And it reduces the amount of summer fallow that we have to do. So this one technology has been, in a good part, responsible for the invention of no and minimum till systems, which has been, you know, astronomical to agriculture. And I think, you guys maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I think summer fallow used to be about, maybe 15% of our land was used on summer fallow. I think it's down now to about 3 or 4%. So that's a really huge technology.
Thank you very much. Okay. Question back there?
Yes, I could have walked down there. Just wanted to spell a few myths. Organic farming, I've been farming as long as Wally. In fact, I was first certified with his agency back in 1995. And not with them anymore, but we're still good friends. I just got off the combine, and we're combining 80 bushel acre barley, direct seeded.
Excuse me, sorry. Can you please ask a question?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. The question I want to ask, and Mr. Lynas mentioned the issue of testing. I want to make reference to the Lynas study. Most of the crops that we're growing now are Roundup ready. And we're finding that it's interesting that Roundup after 90 days causes cancer. In the same rats that Monsanto uses, with only 9 days testing, it's interesting that the regulation in Canada and the US only relies on 90 days testing. They've rigged the regulation to fit the little bit of science they do have. And to me, that is almost criminal, because they know that causes cancer. And they always did know. So we that use Roundup, which I don't, are poisoning ourselves and our children and our customers.
Please, is there a question there?
Well, his question was about the Serralidi rat study, and every food regulatory agency in the industrial world, Europe, Canada, the United States, Australia, and Japan, have come out and looked at the data and totally rejected it because it doesn't even comply with the international standards for doing a safety assessment. So there's no story there. The guy was a horrible researcher. He broke every protocol you could possibly break, and his research is garbage.
Just to add to this, thank you for saying that, Stuart, because it's pretty widely known in the scientific community that Sarah Lynas' study was not a good study. It wasn't a good example of science. In science, there are certain protocols that are followed, and that one kind of missed the boat on a number of levels. The other thing that it did do, and what Sarah Lynas did, which was a big, huge warning flag for me when I was following the whole thing, was that within a week of that study being launched, he also launched a book, and he also launched a movie. And that's a huge flag, because no academic scientist that I know turns their research into a PR movement. And that's exactly what that was. It was very well orchestrated, and it was very well circulated in the media, and it created fear for people, unnecessary fear. There's no smoke. It's not an issue.
I mean, you should talk about the statistics here, because the issue, which is really important, is that the experiments were insufficiently controlled. So you couldn't draw any statistical conclusions from an experiment which had only 10 controlled rats, and then 50 which were in various stages of treatment. And the ones which were supposed to have, I mean, the controls also got cancer. This is a form of rats, Sprague-Dawley rats, which all get cancer if you leave them to live for 2 years. So he chose this, he basically set up this experiment in order to come out with a preconceived conclusion. It was a statistical fishing trip. There was no hypothesis which was being investigated, which is central again to any scientific expertise. And he tried to find, well, is this certain group which has got a certain amount of tumors, and therefore, basically it was a piece of propaganda. And then they had big pictures of these rats with enormous tumors growing out of them. These rats should have been sacrifices. They should have been euthanized. This was against even animal welfare protocols for them to do this. And they were then published in the media. And actually, I happen to know when this study was launched in the media, they made journalists who were attending sign a confidentiality statement so that they couldn't seek any expert comment, because they were desperate to ensure that they just went straight to publication. And this had a real, when I was in Kenya, this one study, the Sarah Lynas study, the activists had taken it to the public health minister, who was herself a cancer survivor, had convinced her that her cancer was caused by GMOs, even though she probably doesn't even eat them, or Roundup, which she's probably not exposed to. And she went in tears to the cabinet meeting with the president and insisted that GMOs should be banned, and then the country changed its policy on the basis of what was nothing better than a scientific hoax. So this kind of thing does do real damage in the world, and that's now curtailed the biotechnology activities which are aimed at protecting food security, like the ones I showed you in the slides, which have been developed by African scientists for African farmers in order to deal with these particular diseases which are really undermining people's ability to feed themselves. So this kind of pseudoscience does real damage in the world. It's important to understand that.
I just want to add to that. The other thing, and I'm glad you brought it up, Mark, and reminded me of this, is that the non-disclosure agreement. This is something that's important to know in the world of journalism. What generally happens if there is a scientific study coming out, it's released to a set of journalists, and they're given an embargo wherein they can't release any of it until a certain date. Never are they asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement. What that embargo period of time allows them to do, it allows them to go around and kind of do a bit of a peer review with other experts so that they can understand what the nature of this particular study is. So that whole notion of Sarah Lynas coming out with that non-disclosure agreement was a huge problem in my mind from a communications perspective. Highly manipulative.
All right. I think I'll take one of the questions from the cards. Have you ever researched any connection of infertility in women to GMO food? Anybody care to tackle that?
You can't research what doesn't exist. It's like trying to do research on ghosts. These products have been through, as Mark said, more testing than any other food product. We've been eating GM products in North America for 19 years now without a single medically documented case of illness. Regulators around the world have studied these products with no reports. Mark talked about the unfortunate incident 2 years ago in Europe with people dying from organic products. for the most part, our food is safe, and there's no linkages to any of those types of myths that exist, and are propagated by a lot of the NGOs in the agriculture community.
I want to step back for a minute and just talk about how we ingest our food and what happens when we eat our food. So I've used this example before. So when we eat fish, for example, it goes into our stomachs, and this fish gets broken down into its bits that we use. So it gets broken down into proteins, carbohydrates, oils, all the building blocks, all the things that our body needs to grow. And but what doesn't happen is the fish DNA does not get inserted into our DNA, right? So we break the food down, we use the food. And so I think that there's maybe a bit of a misconception there. So when things are regulated by our regulatory agencies, they know what to look for. They know, are there things that could cause allergens? Are there potential toxins? Are there changes in the structure? You know, and that's just for food safety. They have a whole regime for environmental safety and livestock safety. So these are experts, people who know what to look for and how this is going to impact us. So I think, you know, you're not going to eat something that contains a GMO, and that gene is not going to get inserted into your DNA.
Right. I'm going to go to the cards again. I think this is an interesting one, because I think it's an important area that some in the anti-GMO movement have used. In GM seeds, who will own the seed's progeny?
Again, so when you purchase a seed, a GMO seed, you're typically paying more for that technology that's put in it. Canada and different countries regulate it differently, but in Canada, you are paying for the technology as opposed to the seed. You're paying for both the seed and the technology, but what's being protected is the technology. So you can take that seed and you can regrow that seed, but what you cannot do is use the technology that's been assigned to the seed. And if you think about it, when you're purchasing anything, a cell phone or anything like that, the company that's selling you that has to have a way to recoup the dollars that it's put into investing in that technology. So when you put together a biotech seed, it costs approximately $100 to $150 million, and it takes 10 to 13 years, right from research to commercialization. So the company has to find a way to be able to recoup those dollars that it's put into research. So it sells you the seed, you purchase the seed, you can plant the seed, and let's use an example of herbicide tolerance. You can spray the field with a herbicide, the weeds will die, but the plant will not. Then that plant grows up, you harvest the seed. You could replant those seeds, but you can't spray the herbicide on it.
Just a point of, not with Monsanto's varieties you can't, because you have to sign a production contract that states you won't do that. So in that case, it's very similar to a lot of niche market commodities that have value that are grown under production contracts. We go in this province somewhere in the neighborhood of 150,000 acres of high uric acid rapeseed that's exported. Again, you sign a contract to produce those varieties, which states you will not regrow the seed. So it's a way for the industry to invest in agriculture by giving farmers the opportunity to grow a limited acreage so that they can help to control the price, because the more acres you have, the lower the price is going to be. So with these niche market products in this area, the acreage is limited, so the prices stay high for the farmers. So when the biotech companies came along, some of them chose to follow that format of contract production, whereby although the growers would sign a contract that stipulates the terms of usage. And other biotech companies have simply put that into the seed price or the chemical price, and producers don't have to sign a contract.
And I mean, this is only, we're only talking about Canada here in the US. I mean, the crops I showed you would be given to farmers free. So golden rice would be mostly open pollinated varieties. I don't think they're even hybrids. So farmers would be encouraged. In fact, that's the whole point of this project, is that they will then grow them year after year after year. So there's nothing inherent in the technology of genetic modification, which means that there has to be this relationship with the companies and the farmers. And I think if you're concerned about this, the important thing is to defend and promote public sector approaches, or a more open source approach to biotechnology, rather than trying to ban the technology in an a priori sense. That's really an illogical response to this. It's a bit like saying that because I don't like the dominance of Microsoft, I want to ban all computers or all computer operating systems. I mean, same with Apple. Apple's the biggest company in the world now, nearly $500 billion turnover, and we're all busily tapping away on our iPhones, even as we're concerned about corporate consolidation. So let's at least be consistent here, and also and remember, ultimately what matters is that farmers should continue to have the choice. Farmers who sign Monsanto's technology agreement sign it because they want to use the types of seed and the technology that offers. No one forces them to do this. They're not slaves. And many farmers in the developing world who want to use technologies, not so much herbicide tolerance, but some of the disease-resistant and insect-resistant crops, which I'm talking about, don't have that choice because they're banned. And the banning of a technology, which is, prohibition based on superstition, is what I really object to.
Well, I'm glad the issue of seed was raised by one of the people in this audience, because that's the most sensitive issue facing not only the organic industry and organic farmers and consumers, it's one of the most serious issues facing mankind, okay? The notion that in Canada, for instance, right now, varieties, which we tried and proven varieties, which organic farmers tend to like, the older ones, are being systematically deregistered, okay? Corporate structures, by and large, own the genetics, and they're systematically having them deregistered so that varieties which we had relied on, can use, are no longer available. In other words, we're being forced to move towards seed which our clients don't want to buy, which consumers, organic consumers, don't want. And I find that very distasteful. I think it's bad science. I think it's also bad government policy that goes along with the notion that these things can be owned firstly, and secondly, that they can be taken away from mankind in the interest of corporate welfare, okay? So I think the seed issue is very, very important to all of us.
But you can still grow deregistered varieties in Canada. It's not illegal to grow a deregistered variety. All that means is there's simply not enough demand for the company that owns the technology to continue producing certified seed. So they're making it freely accessible by deregistering it, letting any farmer in the country that wants to grow it and bin run the seed for as long as they want. We've still got farmers that are growing varieties of wheat from the 1950s. It's not illegal in Canada to do that.
The rest of the story, okay? The rest of the story is that you need to periodically renew your variety, okay? You get about into an F13 population, you get a whole bunch of off-types. And I'm out of my bailiwick here, I'm not a geneticist, but I've seen it happen in Durham where I saved my own seed, and I started getting a pretty variable crop. So the notion was, and this is what we were taught, and I think we're still being taught, is that every now and then you go back to breeder seed and you start over. Well, when you can't buy breeder seed, you can't start over. So that's the rest of the story. Let's be completely frank about how this works. You can't carry on using bin run forever. If you want to have Bethune flax, then you want to go back to Bethune parentage periodically. And that's a fact, okay? This is pure old-fashioned technology.
I just want to ask a question, and that is, any technology advances, anything, everything that we do, we move forward, and if you take a look at the amount of varieties that are available in Canada, go to the CFIA website. There are a huge amount of varieties, so farmers really truly do have choice to grow whatever it is they choose to grow, and so it's really I sometimes wonder, you know, do we want to move backwards or do we want to move forwards?
I'd like to give, Brian Rosnagel, a definite expert in the audience. I'd like to give him a chance to weigh in on this. Is the microphone? It's coming.
The question is for Mark, and the others in the audience on the panel can comment. A couple have been asked this question by me before, but you brought up the issue, Mark, with regard and the ownership issue and so on and so forth. And Jan brought up and made a statement about the cost of producing a GMO variety. And I would strongly suggest that that cost is superbly inflated. And I would ask you that if one of the very great ironies of the anti-GM movement is that it has essentially created a regulatory overburden that is unbelievable in cost, not to mention some of the added scientific cost that is really not necessary, and has in fact taken away this marvelous technology from small and medium enterprises and public system plant breeders and so on, who could use this tool, and that's all it is. It's just another plant breeding tool like the ones we've all used for many, many years. And unfortunately, because of this massive purported cost of producing a GM variety and the huge regulatory burden and the cost associated with that, we simply have taken that opportunity away from particularly the public system and also smaller organizations that can't afford the risks and so on. Would you agree with that?
That's a very leading question, but luckily I do agree substantially. I think you've got to. The proportion I've heard is that the regulatory cost is about 20 to 30% of overall. So it's not doubled it or anything. But I do worry that we're heading in the direction of pharmaceuticals here, where it's going to cost $1 billion from idea to market. And you're not going to see this being a disruptive technology if only the very biggest companies can afford to use it. So that's why I'm saying my plea is for a more open source approach, and that does mean that you have to address the regulatory burden here. And in Europe, the regulatory burden is infinite. It's actually basically blocked the system for nearly 15 years. There was only one event approved for cultivation in maize in Europe, nothing else ever since. And I don't think this has been, well, potatoes were then withdrawn from the market because they were basically rejected. So it's extremely unfortunate. And again, this situation is now being mirrored across Africa, where, as I showed you, there's field trials which have shown that these technologies, these seeds, these crops can work. They've been tested now for many years, but the chance of getting them through regulation it's inconceivable that this is going to happen. And I think this is really an injustice, because the poorest and the most vulnerable and the most needy farmers in the world are being denied the benefits of modern technology because of Western concerns that they're going to be exploited. Well, they're not being exploited. What's happening is they're being forcibly prevented from using technology which could increase their productivity and enable them to feed their kids. And for me, that's a moral wrong.
So, Brian, you know I have to respond. So this study that I'm referring to was just released last year, and it was done by CropLife International. It commissioned it, and it took a look at the companies who are global in nature. So they took an average. So it could, as Mark said, it could take into account places like Europe and everything else. But the interesting piece to me that came out of that was the time is increasing. So years ago, like only 5 years ago, we said it would only take 10 years. It now is up to about 13 years. And the other interesting piece to that is it's shown that the research end is getting quicker, where we have more techniques, we're better at the science, and that piece is getting longer, but what's causing the overall expansion in time is the regulatory burden. So really, in a way, I'm agreeing with what you said. It is deep pockets, and it would be better if more organizations around the world could really do and look at this technology.
All right, thank you. Good conversation there. I just want to go to another one here. Rachel Perrant is a 14-year-old girl from Canada. She is anti-GMO. She has publicly stated to obtain the efficacy from golden rice, vitamin a child would need to eat 27 bowls of rice. If she were here today, what would you say to her?
So you've got that wrong. That's a myth from about 15 years ago. Some of the very first iterations of golden rice did express beta-carotene in very low concentrations, and that's now been fixed, and it's about half a kilo. They're actually, and speaking to the researchers, so in fact the amount that you would eat in a normal meal is enough for about half of your recommended daily amount for children. They've actually not brought it up to 100% because they want to encourage people to have more varied diets, because it's important to have a balanced diet for all sorts of nutritional reasons, not just vitamin A. So they want people to have more leafy vegetables, to eat more fruits, and to push them in that direction. So they don't want this to be a kind of a single solution. It's part of a broader strategy to improve people's dietary deficiencies.
Thank you. I'd just like to get a little more of a comment and context on that. I mean, certainly some of the first GMOs that came out are really designed around industrial farming and the export markets from North America to the world. Now, as Mark, as you've shown, a lot of the next generation GMOs are for small acreage subsistence farmers around the world. How has that changed perceptions of GMO, going from a corporate product to a public good activity?
It's not really changed things at all. And so the activists who I was coming across in Africa, who are funded by Western European development agencies, some of them very well known, whose mandate is to promote food security and to promote poverty alleviation, they are funding activists to go around spreading misinformation about science to stop these farmers having, or even if they had access to them, to stop these farmers ever wanting or being able to use these technologies. And now why is this? Well, it's because there's this worldview which has come around now for 15, 20 years that there's something inherent in GMO technology which is only about promoting corporate monopolization and chemical monocultures and some of the things that you've heard. Yes, to a certain extent that's true, but it's not inherent in the technology. It can be used in an opposite direction to actually undermine and to promote biodiversity and to reduce the use of chemicals in agriculture. So what's at issue here is there's a confusion between farming systems, and organic is a farming system, and farming systems which use more chemicals. So I don't see, in fact, my dad's an organic farmer until recently, and he wrote to our certifier, the Soil Association, saying, why can't I have a GMO potato which is blight resistant? Therefore, I don't even have to use copper sulfate, which is supposedly an organic treatment that's used as a fungicide. I don't know why, but it is. And then I don't have to use any sprays. I don't have to use any controls at all. And they don't have an answer to that, because there's no reason why you draw a line and say this technology is bad and this technology is good. I mean, why does the organic movement use tractors? Why aren't they using horses? I mean, they've drawn the line somewhere, right? So it's not logical. That's what I'm saying. So I think this is what we need to do. We need to have a paradigm shift and talk about, if we're concerned about aspects of the farming system, then let's talk about that. Let's address that. It isn't about how you've developed, how you've bred the seed. It's about how you grow the crop.
All right. I think I should respond to that in part, at least, that the demand for non-GMO food is what drove the standard in Canada and other parts of the world to exclude genetically modified technology. It was consumer driven, okay? The whole organic standard, the whole concept of organic certification, third-party verification, the standard itself, is essentially a consumer driven document, okay? It wasn't somebody in a dark room who decided we're going to exclude genetically modified technology. It was a consumer that sat on these committees and said, this is technology we don't understand. We don't know what the effect will be. There's been no long-term, the word chronic toxicity has not been mentioned in this debate, this discussion this evening. There's no studies on chronic toxicity of almost anything that science has introduced into agriculture. It's always been acute toxicity, okay? Acute toxicity. Mice, rats have to die, have 50% of them. What happens when you have long-term exposure to substances which we don't understand. And that's what the consumers is driven from. Consumer, at the end of the day, is an old saying, the customer is always right. If that's one thing you remember from this meeting tonight, the customer is always right.
I don't think that's quite fair, I'm afraid, because the organic lobby has spent a lot of money and a lot of time demonizing GMOs and did so from the very beginning. In the UK, the Soil Association and the organic lobby has promoted the Seralini study. Remember, I was there in the early stages of the anti-GMO movement, and we were part of the organic sector as we saw it. So I actually think it wasn't consumer-driven. I think consumers were convinced that this was a scary technology, and then went back and said that we didn't want this stuff. But I think it was the people who believed in organic believed that there was something wrong about this, and this was a technology which we shouldn't be using. It was very inherent to the kind of mentality of the organic producers that there was something unnatural, because actually, ultimately, organic production is based on the naturalistic fallacy. That there's artificial and there's natural, and that we should draw a hermetically sealed line between them. And I don't think that's scientific, and I don't think it's even logical.
Let's drag out the old DDT thing, okay? There was a time in history when DDT was considered safe. It was useful in killing mosquitoes and preventing malaria. Mankind, the consumer, and government have long since gotten rid of DDT because of the damages associated with it, okay? Now, when it was first introduced, it was fine. You could drink it. You could put it on your cows. My grandmother put it on her cows' udders before she milked. The cows, they were organic cows, by the way. They weren't certified, but they were organic. But she used DDT all over that barn. I remember being sprayed with it. It was safe. The same people, only a different generation, maybe several generations, told us that DDT was safe at that time. And now you have the consumer, again, being told that these compounds, which haven't been tested, chronic toxicity tests are not required, are safe. So you do have a basis for skepticism in history. You know, history is a good thing for us in terms of where we're going in the future.
Okay. I'm going to move along. Oh, yes, you had a question.
Hi, I'm an exchange student from Sweden, so I'm sorry if I trip over my own words here, but my question boils down to land use conflict, essentially. With more and more farmers growing biomass for energy instead of food and the increasing food demand, what role do you think GMOs has in solving this problem?
I didn't quite get that. Can you say it more slowly? What role? I mean, I differ from many of my farming colleagues in being very skeptical about biofuels. I don't think it's actually a very appropriate use of land, particularly to grow food crops, which are then burned to provide fuels. This is one of the reasons why I promoted nuclear power, in fact, is because we desperately need very large-scale sources of low-carbon energy, which don't entail large-scale conversion of ecosystems. Biofuels are very energy inefficient in that you get very little watts per square meters of power produced. So in fact, solar power is actually very energy efficient in that sense. It's a very good use of land. So if you look at it in that metric, biofuels is about the worst possible option. So, if I'm making an argument about why we need to increase productivity and how we can use biotechnology to do that, I don't think converting large amounts of our agricultural land to produce biofuels is a very sensible thing to do.
I'm just going to disagree with Mark and agree with Wally on this one. Wally was talking about how we need to get some soils back into perennial production, and genetically modified grasses and alfalfas offer a really good opportunity for biomass production that contributes to sustainable agriculture, because we're taking these marginal soils out of annual crop production and putting them into long-term grass production for biomass. So it really leads to what Wally's talking about in terms of the organic sustainability concept, and taking some of these marginal soils out of crop production and putting them into biofuel production.
Take the marginal soils out of crop production and just return them to nature. I mean, let trees grow on them, let the perennial prairies return, let the natural ecosystems take back over.
Yeah,
the point is, in land sparing, the point is to let the land return to nature. That's the whole idea.
But somebody's got to buy that land from the farmer. And do you think that's a fair cost to society to do that?
Okay, thank you very much. We've only got a few minutes left. We need to wrap it up about 8:45, is that right? Okay, is there any other questions from the floor? Over there. Well, we're getting you a microphone. I'm going to put Ag West on the spot here. We've got a lot of great questions on cards here that we're just not going to get to. I'm going to put Ag West on the spot and say they're going to put these questions up with some answers onto their website. Okay, terrific. Go ahead.
I just wanted to talk about in regards to labeling. First of all, or I'm not sure if many people know, but apples are one of the worst for pesticide application. And so for me, like, I don't buy everything organic, but apples definitely I do, because I like to eat the skin of the apple. And I'm just really an advocate for consumers. I'd like to take away consumer deception as much as possible. And so I was wondering, like, how long is it going to take for them to label more onto the packaging so that we can make, you know, our decision easier, I guess, as far as...
While you've got the microphone, can I just ask you, do you want foods to be labelled if they've been produced using radiation mutagenesis?
I think it's important that everything goes onto the label of the foods, and then we can decide for ourselves what we want to buy. I just don't think anything needs to be hidden from the consumer. So we all have the right to know, right, what's going into our foods. And for example, there's apples that I see sometimes, well, they'll say coated with food grade vegetable wax, and those will be conventionally grown apples, but they don't actually say like what's underneath the wax. Could be a bunch of pesticides for all we know, right? I mean, but I'm just asking, like, how long do you think it'll take for them to label everything onto the, you know, onto every food that you need?
The labeling issue is another hot button issue for the GMO issue.
You're right, it's consumer driven, but until consumers want to pay more for that, companies aren't going to supply it. And it's pretty simple. It's sort of first year economics that if consumers aren't demanding and expressing a willingness to pay for that, and grocery manufacturers look at what products are moving off the shelf. So if all of a sudden products that were voluntarily labeled as GM suddenly started selling 10-to-1 to products that weren't, the food industry would notice this and they would respond. But consumers are not expressing a preference in grocery stores to buy products that are labeled non-GM.
So why can't you just buy organic apples? And I mean, you just said organic excludes all GMOs, so why can't you just buy organic foods?
You know, you could, I mean, a person, of course, like, I guess for me, I'd like to buy most things organic. I mean, you know, there's a price increase too. I just believe that we all are entitled to healthy, affordable food, and, you know, we all deserve that, right? I just wish the cost would go down a lot more for things that are healthier. I mean, junk food's cheap, right? But doesn't mean we should be buying it.
I think this speaks to the fact that we all are we love food. I love food. It's a very personal choice consuming our food and how and what we consume. Labels are an interesting thing because this debate debate around labeling or not to label GMOs is a big issue that seems to be recurring all the time. The reality is that labeling here in Canada, actually in North America, you don't label unless there is an allergenicity issue or there's been a compositional change in the nutritional value of the product. So it kind of violates the legal, am I saying that right? Yeah, like, I mean, it doesn't, and the other thing with GMOs that some people are concerned about is that it becomes a negative labeling. So are people seeing GMOs as being something that's negative or a warning label? That's another concern that sometimes comes out. But the problem is too, is that when we start labeling for things, whatever they are, and even as Mark said, very detailed things, Where do we put all that information? Where do we find meaning in that information? And I think as a consumer, what I want when I look at a label, I want what I read to be meaningful, and I want to understand it. Otherwise, it doesn't have any value for me. And paying extra for that label when it doesn't mean anything, that matters to me. So, you know, price does matter in all this.
Go ahead, Wally. Is there any other questions? Oh, quite a few now. Okay.
I want to just a short comment on the labeling thing. There was a time when pesticide-free was a desirable label, and that disappeared when people realized that organic was inherently pesticide-free, so that label disappeared. There is a demand now. 50% of people that are now going to shelf in California, apparently, are looking for non-GMO as well as organic, okay? And it takes a while to educate them to say, look, if you want non-GMO, just buy organic, okay? And Mark mentioned that as well, so that sometimes these temporary labels, what you're asking for is GMO labeling. And that's a right that the consumer has. But I think it's much easier just to go with the organic label and not worry about all the other substances.
Another question? Let's try and get in a few more questions before we have to call it a night.
Hi, I'm just wondering if you guys can comment on the future of GMO wheat production, specifically in Canada and Saskatchewan.
I'll take that one. I think that there is a lot that we can do within wheat to increase yields and resistance to disease and insects, and I think there's a lot of work already happening in that area. So from my perspective, we're probably not going to see GMO wheat. I wouldn't think certainly much sooner than 10 years at the, you know, because I think, like I said, part of it's also going to be driven by consumer demand. And so right now, I just don't think that there's enough consumer demand. I think that there's enough that we can do without using GMO technology. And so I think that that's going to be, at least initially, the future for wheat.
If I could just,
sorry, yeah, no,
I'm going to jump in here with a comment as well. Biotechnology is a lot more than just GMOs. And wheat breeders and other breeders right now are using biotechnology tools to advance their breeding programs through conventional means and being able to use those tools to get farther faster in their breeding cycles. So it's a lot more than just GMOs.
Oh, sorry, on that note. Also, too, at the University of Manitoba, where they're working on research in organics and agroecology, they use biotechnology. They use those tools and techniques to understand the plants so that they can better develop them so that they work better in the field. We should be careful when we vilify the technology because it does add value across all agriculture. And I come from this from my perspective is that all ag is good ag. We're providing food, we're a primary source, the farmers are the primary source. So this provides them with better options.
And I just recently came from a meeting in Delhi in India of scientists working on wheat rust, stem rust in particular. So there's the new UG99 rust variety, which has really devastated wheat as far as the Middle East now. So that the great threat is that could move into South Asia. It's not made it to North America yet, but that could happen. So this is potentially a serious threat to one of humanity's major staple foods. Now there's two very important resistance genes which have now been identified, SR33 and SR35, which were on the front page of Science Journal in the same week that we had the meeting. And really, and these are resistant to UG99, and if both genes were added together, then potentially that resistance could last for quite a long time. The only way to do this probably is using transgenics, though, because of the linkage drag issue, that these genes have been identified in what are basically Bronze Age grass. You know, it would take a very, very long time to backcross that into getting, and you wouldn't be able to get both genes at the same time either. So there will be uses of transgenics probably to forestall the advance of new diseases, which will be essential in wheat, probably earlier, I think, than the 10-year timescale.
All right, I'm sorry, we're out of time. We've actually gone a little bit over time. Thank you very much for your questions. We're going to get to all of these. A lot of great questions there. A lot of great conversation and discussion tonight. I'm just going to invite Wilf up to close us out, and a couple of door prizes, right?
Thank you very much. Thank you one more time to the panelists and to Mark, our guest speaker. Terrific evening. Thank you for all your efforts. Ladies and gentlemen, please acknowledge it. Have a great evening.